Hello. Hello again. I'm going to pick off directly where we left off, pick it up where we left off at the end of the last lecture when we were talking about the um, Qin Dynasty and how they will sort of weave together a narrative that brings together elements of legalism with some Confucianism and some um, Taoism to give us an image of legitimacy. But to go back, the Qin Dynasty, which begins in the year 221 and will last till the year 205, 206, is a short lived but very, very important period of Chinese history because effectively the Qin are going to sort of be the ones to sort of drag the sort of warring states out of that period of internal competition in which there is no one single power that is ruling overall, a period of time that was fruitful in terms of the growth of intellectual discourse and debate about the nature of governance and people's place in it, the place of laws and punishment and things like that, the place of the family and sort of harmony and respect within the family, mirroring the harmony and respect in a hierarchically organized societies, the place of education. So much of that gets debated and discussed back and forth by those several figures that we looked at. But remember, Chinese talk about it as the period of 100 masters. So we have sort of taken the top few who really seem to represent the sort of the tradition that will go forward and influence things. So who exactly are the Qin? What is the Qin Dynasty? This is a group that under King Zheng, from 230 to 221, well, in the year 230, he makes a decision to push for, to take his armies that he's grown and consolidated during the period of the Warring States, in which each of the individual states was, investing money in growing their particular armies and their weapons and things like that. But no one particular power had been able to, at this particular point in time in the year 230 BCE, King Zheng feels like, and he has a minister who whispers in his ear that these are the kinds of moments that come every 1,000 years, and those who will be remembered as great are those who take advantage of it. Are you that kind of person? And he takes the advice, engages then in a process of conquest, in which his army is larger, more organized. The resources coming in enable him to really develop a stronger army than anyone else. And he begins in the conquest of the other surrounding 6 states. He will continue that into further areas on the outskirts. He will then also introduce a very strong bureaucracy, really sort of controlled from the center, which will create a powerful central state in which he is in charge of all things to the extent that a single individual can. But certainly Zheng is the person who's going to push administrative reforms and reorganizations, and also engage in a series of legal actions, creating laws, punishments, following the sort of the dictates of legalism and specifically of Han Fei, to make sure that laws are strict, severe, and certain, that they will indeed sort of force people to follow them. And as we look back now, right, looking at the flow of history, certainly the period leading up to this was a period, beginning in the the autumn and the spring period of the Eastern Zhou. After, the 771, they move the capital to the east and they create the Eastern Zhou. And we have this period in which gradually the peripheral areas are gaining in power and becoming more independent, right? Until finally we come to the stage in which the Zhou are sort of nominally in charge, but really they're not in charge. And indeed, each of the individual states have worked very hard to sort of separate themselves off and develop systems of their own systems of weights and measures, their own currency, their own form of writing and things like that, right? And so they are all trying to sort of separate themselves off from central control and to sort of individualize themselves from others, right? And so you have this breakdown of any sense of, shared allegiance, common culture. They're moving in a different direction. And within this context, then you get people like Confucius rising up and saying, this is what you need to do to reestablish a state that gains the respect of the citizens and has control over it and things like that, right? And he'll be challenged by Lao Tzu, who says, no, we need spontaneity, we need to follow nature when you try to impose your will. And okay, we've been through that already, right? But out of this will come the figure of Zheng, who will defeat the other warring states and begin the process of creating what will be then perhaps the first, indeed the first of the truly great Chinese dynasties. They're going to last, say, until the start of the 20th century. So what does he do? Well, after having conquered it, this is a person who indeed has already thought carefully about the process of governance. What I've been trying to say so far in the class is there is a difference between governance and the use of power, conquest, and the use of power to subjugate people, and then to set up structures that will guarantee your control as you delegate authority to other peoples, other individuals, right? And so Zheng comes up with a system that, first of all, divides the 7 states landmass into 36 provinces with smaller subdivisions. Text refers to them as counties, right? But the provinces are like states, right? They don't want to use the state because the state was the word they were using for sort of the older kingdoms that existed before. So the 36 provinces. And what's interesting is each province then is assigned by Zheng himself both a civilian leader and a military leader. In other words, separating off military power from civilian control. And civilian control refers to taxations, the imposition of taxes, the imposition of the legal system on those people, also getting civilians involved in public projects, of which the Qin will certainly do that as part of their rule there, right? And they also assign imperial inspectors, right? Again, I find the Chinese example to be interesting in so many ways. First of all, the intellectuals that we look at, and I tried to point to this in the last lecture, have, real sort of reverberations in events in Europe and America, centuries, millennia later, right? That they are discussing issues that transcend the individual context, and they are universal to all systems of governance and control, like, for example, the delegation of authority to other figures. And I also mentioned in an earlier lecture when we were talking about the growth and development of bureaucracies, and how bureaucracy fits right into this debate about delegating authority and not losing control over those people that are there, is that when you have a bureaucracy really is an extension of the powers of the central government, but it has been sort of focused on a specific area. Take the DMV, right? And certainly the DMV is not Vatican City, right? It's not a huge bureaucracy here in this country, but it certainly is a way of seeing how the government says we need to get control over this phenomena. What's this phenomena? Motorized vehicles. And you can, sometimes I imagine myself in my retirement writing the history of the DMV, which sounds boring as hell, but actually would be kind of interesting if you really got into what were the factors that sort of push people into accepting the extension of government powers over their life, such that I couldn't just go out and buy a motorized vehicle. Now I had to go in, demonstrate that I could actually drive it without killing people, right? All of these things, and where it started, how it spread, and how as a bureaucracy, it's restricted, but then it sort of looks at heading other areas. Well, motorcycles, right? Trucks, all kinds of licenses, and now boats and things like that. And what I'm suggesting is, bureaucracies are part of this struggle between the government and the government's power, and not abusing and overextending its power. So you create, uprisings against the government and things like that, right? So in any case, one of the things that the Qin do in this particular context, in addition to assigning separate civilian and military governors in provinces, together with imperial inspectors who will, report directly back to the king, the emperor, in the imperial center, is that Qin, who has really, really sort of studied this, says, okay, civilian governors cannot serve in their home areas. Why? Why would you do that? Hell, wouldn't it be better to take a person who's from that area, who knows the issues, knows the people, things like that, and so you have an inside view as opposed to bringing an outsider who doesn't know the area and may be imposing solutions that were valid way over there, but when you bring them here, they're not valid. Well, the larger issue for the emperor is how do I make sure that that guy who's there does not begin to sort of make contact with locals and hence begin to develop an independent power base from my own. So one of the things they do is they will send these governors and military people to areas that are not home areas, so that they don't have pre-existing contacts and relationships with people there. Another thing is, don't leave them there very long, switch them around, move them to other places. The longer they stay there, the longer they get cozy with local people, the longer there is the possibility that they may indeed develop power bases that I may be unaware of, right, back home, and this kind of a thing. Well, the organization of society under the Qin goes even deeper than that, right? So they're going to develop like a census, but even deeper than that. They are going to register all common people, so that we, the government, know exactly how many people are there, what they are, what kind of taxes that could pay. And so that when males arrive at maturity inside families, just like with the Roman game, they will be registered for purposes of taxation, conscription, joining the armies, for armies, and also not just for conscription into the army, but conscription into public work gangs, right? And part of the taxes you could pay was to pay by working on public projects, which indeed the Qin will do quite a bit of. Beyond that, as I mentioned previously, um, Zheng will be a follower. Actually, he has a prime minister who has read the writings of Han Fei and is a believer in um, the core precepts, the core ideas of Han Fei, of legalism, right? And so very quickly, the imperial rule becomes an imperial rule controlled by very, very harsh laws, strict laws with harsh punishments for any member of society. So there is no exclusive elite classes that are eliminated from this. Anyone could be subject to the kinds of penalties that the Qin are going to impose on their population, right? Um, uh, Initially, when Jing comes into power, um, he looks at the past with all of that sort of debate, and he sees that as dangerous, and he sees then scholars as dangerous, right? People with free minds and thinking for themselves, and this kind of a thing, and so he will engage in attacks on scholars, and doing things like going into private residences and burning any books they had, other than books that they felt were valuable in terms of, say, technical books, books about medicine, books about trade, commerce, manufacturing, things like that. Those kind of texts you could keep, but Confucius and the classics and stuff like that, who sort of debate the freedom of the individual to stand up to government if government is not fulfilling its promise. Those kinds of things they try and get rid of. And again, the goal is to unify. They're coming out of a period of sort of the center couldn't hold, and there's all of these sort of forces pulling away from the center. And so the Qin are going to implement a whole series of different actions that you sort of, when you take a higher point of view, you sort of see, okay, what the intent here is to create unified systems across the board in all of the areas. So the first thing they'll start with is writing. And we've seen how writing was growing in importance. Indeed, under the Warring States period, writing had grown and expanded. But again, the level of expertise to be able to both write and read Chinese script was rather difficult. And at the same time, individual areas, these warring states, individual states were sort of developing their own system of calligraphy, of writing, of doing the ideographs, the graphic representation of ideas, which is what the Chinese writing is all about. Chinese don't write words with an alphabet like we do. They write, they draw, if you will, abstract pictures that represent ideas that have been highly formalized over time, right, and become increasingly more abstract. And hence, you really have to go to school and work on them hard. And they say today you need at least 3,000 to 4,000. You need to be able to read and decipher at least 3,000 to 4,000 ideographs. But at this particular point in time, they're talking about 9,000 to 10,000, right? Which is to say that you've got to study. Imagine how hard it is for students in our own schools to do our alphabet, where we have how many letters are there in the alphabet, and and variations, things like that, right? So we have about somewhere between depending on the regional dialect, 25 to 30 different sounds, that we can write out with the letters that we have in combinations in different forms. Well, you can imagine if, what are we working for? What does our alphabet have? It's been a long time. I don't know how many letters are there in the alphabet. 27, I think it is. Well, I could Google that, but I can't right now because it will probably destroy this. Don't want to waste it. How long it takes kids to learn the alphabet to write, this kind of a thing, with a system as relatively simple as ours is. And there are admittedly problems there in our system because our system is not entirely perfect, right? Be that as it may, it has historical origins when they put together the writing system about the time of Shakespeare and modern writing, and then sort of evolved over time, and we're continuing to manipulate and play games with it. So one of the first things that the Qin did was to create something called small seal. Let's see, do I have it written here? I think it's small seal. Yeah, small seal script, which is their contribution of it. A smaller form of graphic writing that mirrors a little bit what was used during the Shang period with the oracle bones, but is indeed evolving in the direction of more modern systems of calligraphy that we'll see in the Han Dynasty and moving on from there, the Tang Dynasty later on. So what they will mandate is a standardized form of writing, and they will banish with extreme punishments any regional variations. The small seal script becomes the official script, and indeed legally the only one, used by bureaucrats to communicate between the capital and regional governments. So anytime they, and again, this, in the history of China, as groups come in and conquer, they end up sort of inheriting the literati, the educated people who serve as bureaucrats to make the regime run. And as much as they may hate them when they walk in, very quickly they learn, like the Qin, that they are valuable and they're important, and the only way that you can sort of, with our writing system, right? Interesting how the writing system that evolved there will influence decisions of politics and government and governing and things like that. With our writing system, you are dependent on people who have spent years in training to be able to receive edicts from the capital, read them, explain them to the population. But of course, the challenge between the Catholic Church and Protestantism, right, will sort of highlight something similar, where the Catholic Church sort of maintains control over the Bibles in Latin, and the Protestant movement is designed to put a Bible into every person's hand, teaching them to read, to understand it, translate it into vernacular. With the first wave of Protestantism, one of the things that Martin Luther will do is to translate parts of the Bible into German so that it can be printed and distributed. Well, you can see those sort of variations here where this system of writing maintains a degree of control in the hands of the bureaucrats, the literati. What else do they do, right? Okay, so they're also going to promote standardized systems of weights and measures. Something that we saw in the Indus River Valley as a sort of an outlier of sorts. How was it possible to have this over such a broad area as the Indus River Valley covered? The Indus River Valley peoples, the Harappan culture, if you will, the Harappan civilization, how was it possible to indeed ensure unified systems of weights and measures over such a broad period when there was very, very little clear indication of a ruling class, a governing body, and so they're an outlier. Here we see with the Qin, we see how we would expect something like this to come about as a mandate from the top down, right? In any case, so you get standardized weights and measures throughout these 7 states that have been brought together, right? Which will help promote commerce and trade, right? Obviously, right? Even though Zheng is not a big fan of it, of commerce and trade, this particular measure of standardizing weights and measures, and then together with that, creating a common currency, coins that the Qin then learn how to mint in quantity and try and control the value of the coins over time. It will obviously help redound to the benefit. It will help benefit the merchant class, even though the Qin are not terribly supportive of them. Still, we do see that happening, and particularly when we put this in line with one of the things that we have seen other large-scale empires engage in, which is the building of roads. And given the size and the expanse of the Chinese empire at the time, and over time it's going to expand, and indeed during the period after the conquest, they will go out into peripheral areas and start to expand even more to grow the empire. You need roads to be able to, transport certainly people, goods, but also military forces back and forth to address the outbreak of possible rebellion in different parts. And again, those are the kinds of public projects that the Qin will sponsor, the building of roads, but together with irrigation, the growth of farming regions, right? This is a economically progressive regime, even though it is very restrictive in certain regards. It is trying to promote the wealth base of the nation, much of which will come back to the state in the form of taxes. But keep in mind, the peasants in China are effectively the backbone of the Chinese civilization. And they're not slaves. In other words, when we compare China with Greece and Rome, we see there in Greece and Rome, the rapid growth of slave systems in society. Proliferation, there it is, proliferation. Not using it yet, yeah, I am losing it slowly, but so the proliferation of slavery in Rome will eventually undermine the Roman game, force Romans to switch to a professional army rather than a citizen army, and ultimately will undermine their defenses as they are forced to bring in German speakers, Visigoths, who will join in the north and become part of it, right? So government support for agriculture will include the creation of canals and irrigation systems and things like that. But this is a system of government that is very much kind of in your face, right? Very much in your face. One of the punishments might be getting your nose cut off or your ears cut off, right? If there are any indication that you've been saying bad things about them, right? But it's definitely the kind of government that rejects the idea of laissez-faire. Let them do, do their own business themselves, right? There are rules for working the fields, rules that are laws that, if broken, can be punished with extreme forms of punishment, right? The system set up will tax individuals, tax individual farming households. And remember, we saw how individual peasants had gained a degree of independence from the aristocratic classes in the preceding period of the warring states, which is really sort of creating a situation where if things are good for them, they can grow and expand. There will be rules for constricting labor for irrigation and canal systems. Okay. Now they will continue to, shall we say, use the idea of ancestor worship. They'll also use the mandate of heaven to justify their position. And indeed, one of the ways that the literati, the intellectual class, will gain some favor with the king, the king/emperor, is by sort of using the sort of ideology of the mandate of heaven to sort of write up reports that justify the need for King Zheng to act in the way that he did, because others had lost, the Zhu, in fact, had lost the mandate of heaven and were no longer in charge and no longer able to control, right? Okay. Okay, so peasant families, who are sort of the great masses of the people there, are taxed but pay relatively small taxes compared to ways that had been taxed before, but they are forced to send their sons into the military. They are free to work their own land, just like the freeholders in Rome, interestingly enough, and they provide the economic foundation of the Chinese Empire by producing the food that will feed the army and feed the citizens in their urban centers, right? So over time then, over this period of time, it's only 20 years, right? 20, 25 years, the conquest and everything. They're going to promote a money economy that's going to create a class of merchants who will sort of be centered in China's cities that become market centers rather than fortresses. So before this, leading up, cities were fortresses, fortified areas of residence in which local rulers would reside, and outlying areas would bring food in from the farming regions. They are now sort of morphing into market centers. This will be important as we move forward into the Han Dynasty, right? And so all of this, during a relatively brief period of time, is going to move China in the direction of an acceptance of contracts between individuals who are not necessarily kin-based. Prior to this, groups were formed by kinship units to go in and help each other out in a cooperative fashion. We're now moving in a direction of contract and contract-based kinds of payments using the currency that's there. Merchants are beginning to grow a bit as suddenly we have pacified the land and sort of spread the possibilities for the movement of goods on the new roads that have been created. But as I said, this is going to break down rather quickly, right? And lead to the collapse of the Qin. So there is a rebellion in the year 211 of conscripted workers who are sort of, they've had it with the abuse and the system of exploitation that exists there by the government of them, of their people. You have a rebellion that sort of touches bases with nobles who are sort of have been removed by the Qin from the centers of power, and sort of are willing to align with these groups. Um, it leads to a sort of a broad outbreak of rebellion in society. In 210, the emperor Zheng dies, and is followed by a series of weak successors, right? Um, the last of whom commits suicide. Um, and so they are, there isn't the passage of um, a strong lineage of a dynastic lineage, and so there isn't that ability to hold together, and so a one of the leaders of the opposition gains control after the death of the last son uh, of the emperor, and he decides to recreate a confederation of states as had existed before, when indeed there had been sort of this constant warfare between different groups, um, partially because he is um, owes his own resistance and ability to raise an army to these other groups of nobles who have come to his support, and who would like to be set up as kings in their own right, this kind of a thing. Doesn't work. What will happen then is that begins to break down into anarchy, if you will. And an individual who was something of a policeman bureaucrat will rise up and create the Han Dynasty under his control, and he moves then to then impose control over the outlying areas, and will quickly by the year 206 have taken advantage of the types of institutional reforms that Zheng had put into place to unify and centralize power in his own hands. This individual will then create the first Han Dynasty in the year 206, and it will last till the year 9 of the Common Era, and then we'll, after a break of some 14, 15, 16 years, right? There's a so-called usurper, a person who tries to step into the power vacuum at the heart of the Han Dynasty, and he will be removed in the year 25, and at that point the Han Dynasty goes into the second period and the second stage, weakened somewhat, but still able to survive then, right? Okay, so what do we have here? We have here a brief interlude in which one individual rises up, and we might say, as was necessary, to use force to impose centralized control over a situation that was perhaps going to evolve into a balkanization, a breaking up into smaller, independent political entities without the possibility of a single overarching ruling system of government coming into power. The Qin will do that. They will also then bring into power reforms in the military, new forms of military equipment. Chinese armies grow in size and power. They become more powerful. They develop highways. They use the growing population in China itself to then build canals, irrigation systems, build roads, highways to all parts of it, right? It falls apart very quickly, perhaps because it was so brutal, following the model of legalism. When the Han Dynasty comes into effect, it is going to claim that it has nothing to do with legalism. It is following the master Confucius, questions of harmony and respect and cooperation, all of that, and our laws are not going to be as brutal as and so they want to separate themselves off. The Han want to separate themselves off. Textbook is very good because the textbook will explain to you that more recently historians have really gone back in, and rather than taking the word of representatives of the state who for purposes of posterity and the legacy and things like that, claim that the Han was revolutionary in terms of being much lighter, a lighter touch with people, much more, appealing to the masses at large because no longer imposed brutal punishments and stuff like that. And the historians have gone in and sort of done the analysis that have literally said that ain't true, right? When you compare the laws and the punishments of the laws and the application of the laws in individual cases to what they saw in the Qin, even though the Qin period was much shorter, it certainly appears that the Han were just as dedicated to imposing their will through the courts and the laws on the population at large to create and control this vast empire that will morph into the Han Dynasty, which we will talk about in our next lecture. Thank you.